a great, show of people here. Thank you for coming out. It's a beautiful day, and so great to see so many of you here joining us today. Welcome. Today's event is Embodied Memories, Japanese Americans Across Generations. I'm Lok Su. I am the chair of the Asian American Research Center and also professor of ethnic studies here at Berkeley. I just want to quickly ask you to please turn off your cell phones so we don't have any uncomfortable rings, throughout the talk. And hello to all the people on the Zoom as well. And for people on Zoom, please go ahead and submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. Let me begin the event with a land acknowledgement, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichen, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited from using and occupying this land since the institution's founding, actually in 1868. Consistent with the university's values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to the Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and our commitment to hold the university accountable to the needs of American Indians and Indigenous peoples. I want to also thank all our sponsors. We have a long list of sponsors who really make this event possible. They are the Asian American Research Center, the Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies Program, the Department of English, the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities, the Japanese American Studies Advisory Committee, the Center for Japanese Studies, and the Othering and Belonging Institute. I want also to thank the Latinx Research Center for offering us this beautiful space to host this event. And there are also a number of staff people who are here and students who have helped make this happen. I want to give a shout out to Deborah Lustig, to Max Vanderwalker, and Jess Jang, Claire Kim, and other volunteers, and Josh Acosta, he's here as well. Also want to acknowledge the East Wind Books for making available all of Karen's books that are here. So please, before you go, make sure you stop by and pick up a few books on your way out. This is a part of a series of the inaugural Artist in Residence program. Karen is our first artist in residence in the Asian American Research Center. When we founded the center, we really wanted to make sure that we have the space to promote and Asian American issues and interests. And we're really excited, that we have this opportunity to bring in artists such as yourself to come and speak to the campus and to the community. Let me go ahead and introduce our moderator for today, who will then introduce the panelists. Dr. Lisa Tsuchitani is a faculty member in the Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program in the Ethnic Studies Department at UC Berkeley. A recipient of the Chancellor's Public Service Award for Community Engaged Teaching in 2020, Dr. Tsuchitani centers her research teaching and advocacy efforts on critical race theory, critical pedagogy, and educational equity issues. She is the founder and chair of the Japanese American Studies Advisory Committee. She is also the inaugural faculty co-chair of the Asian American and Pacific Islander Standing Committee. In recognition of Dr. Tsuchitani's philanthropic and outreach services to the campus, she was awarded the Spirit of 1868 Volunteer Award by the UC Berkeley Foundation. She is also the co-editor of Mountain Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, which traces the history of student movements in the 1960s at the San Francisco State University, UC Berkeley, and UCLA. So welcome, Dr. Tsuchitani.
Thank you, Rob. Tonight, I'm really honored to be moderating this discussion with two of the most prolific and profound contributors to the field of Asian American Studies, Tei Yamashita and Philip Kan Gotanda. Tei Yamashita is the author of 8 books, including I Hotel, a finalist for the National Book Award, and most recently, Something and Sensibility, all published by Coffee House Press. Recipient of the National Book Foundation 2021 Medal for Distinguished Contributions to Literature, as well as a U.S. Artists Ford Foundation Fellowship. She is currently Professor Emerita of Literature and Creative Writing at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Over the last 4 decades, librettist and independent filmmaker Philip Kan Gotanda has written a cycle of works in theater, film, song, and opera that chronicle Japanese America from the 1900s to the present. A graduate of Hastings College of Law, he is a recipient, as well as a recipient of the prestigious Guggenheim and Dramatists Guild Playwrights Legacy Initiative Awards. He is a professor and vice chair of the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies here at the University of California, Berkeley. Tonight, Karen and Philip will be honoring us with their reflections about their work, and more specifically, their intersections and inspirations, as well as their hopes for the future of Japanese American studies and Japanese American communities locally and diasporically. We collectively have prepared a few questions to facilitate our conversation in ways that perhaps the wine alone may not do, after which we will have some time for question and answer from all of you here today and our virtual audience. So with that, Karen and Philip, shall we begin?
All right.
And I'm going to bring you up here, and I think there's some presentations they want to do.
Okay, so I'm doing it first?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Locke. There's Jessica, Max, Deborah, the Latinx Center, and also the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, and certainly the new Asian American Resource Center. Thank you, all of you, for inviting me. I'm so honored. I'm really flabbergasted, and I'm having a great time here with all of you today, this week. And thank you to Phil Gotanda for being here.
And bringing the
And bringing the
Lambrusco.
wine. Yeah. So I thought do you mind if I sing a song? Or that's rhetorical, isn't it? I was thinking about, of course, the wine. Right? So there are 2 versions of this song. It's a sushi song. And my friend Vicky Abe composed one version for a musical called Godzilla Comes to Little Tokyo. And Glenn Horyuchi composed another version for something we called No Bozos, N-O-H Bozos. And I have this old idea that I wanted to combine flamenco with sushi, and then we'd have flamenco dancing on top of a sushi bar. I know I can see you tonight, but I thought that would be great for theater. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, you said
Yeah.
it. So you're gonna do it for me now. So let's see. The only way. Okay, I can't sing.
Want some wine, Karen?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Right here.
The only way to eat fish is to eat it raw. To wrap your tongue around each piece is like a more. To touch your lips, a subtle innuendo. To taste a hidden and forbidden libido. Let the sake trickle down your throat. Let the ginger crunch between your teeth. Let the wasabi thunder up your nose. Okay. Gotta get my sushi fix. Let me at my chopsticks. Gotta get some raw fish to chew. Dipper in the old shoyu. Gonna get my last piece of maguro. If it's the last thing I do. That's enough. Well, more seriously, I started a new project and it's on questions 27 and 28. And I'm not going to explain that because I'm not. You know, right? Okay, say. So I wanted to read a short excerpt from one chapter of this project. And it's only an excerpt from the chapter. And it's called Haruko, Mother Earth. So perhaps you recognize this painting by the artist Chiura Obata. It hangs in the Young Museum in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. Obata immigrated to the United States in 1903, working at various jobs while always pursuing his art. Eventually, he taught art here at Cal Berkeley. In 1942, he was imprisoned with his family at Tanforan Assembly Center in San Bruno, and then in the Topaz concentration camp in Delta, Utah, where he founded an art school. Chiura Obata met and married Haruko Kohashi in San Francisco in 1912. And while Chiura's story is well known, it is often, as is often the case with stories of women, Haruko's story remains behind the scenes. Chiura's art was sumi-e painting. Haruko's art was in the cultivation and arranging of flowers. So here's the story. Murakami-san was an old man, maybe older than Papa when he died. It was summertime, warm air, sticky and slow. It's hard to believe I could only be 10 and sit so quietly. He put 3 leaves of baran okame in my hands. Baran grows simply from moist oil in leafy bunches. Ornamental leaves, not flowers, not so special you would think. But these narrow elliptical leaves had white stripes moving through dark green, each the same and yet different. I felt the glossy smoothness and the soft veins flowing from stem to tip, front side and underside, the delicate strength and peculiar curve of each leaf. This one longer, this shorter, thicker here, paper thin here. Stand the tallest leaf upward to heaven, the mid-side leaf to one side is man, and the shortest to the other side nearest the earth, a triangle of life. But take care, turn this leaf to face forward, but to which direction the others, and their white shapes and their white stripes. How do their patterns flow? How would you come upon these leaves in a shaded grove, dappled in sunlight, wet with rain? This was my first lesson. Heaven, do you see that beautiful woman there in that painting? That is me. I came with my father to San Francisco in 1910 to live at the Nagasaki-ga. This was a boarding house for Japanese run by my aunt on Geary Street. My aunt wanted me to work at the house, but I refused. I told her I'd come to America to learn to sew. I might have said that I came to America to be free of tight kimonos. But what did I really know? I was 18 years old. In those days, I might have been the only single Japanese woman in all of San Francisco. News travels. Men came to the boarding house to check me out, followed me on the street. What a nuisance. Every month there was another marriage proposal. Oh, well, that's true. Finally, I married Papa. He made a proposal to my father said his plan was to study in Europe, then return to Japan. I wanted to go to Europe, so I said yes. To this day, I have never been to Europe. I got married at Ogawa Tei, a restaurant on California and Grant. This was just after the New Year in 1912. We had a difficult time finding a place to live. First, we rented an apartment on Bush Street outside of Nihonmachi. I cleaned it sparkling and made a vegetable and flower garden in the yard. But just when my seeds were sprouting, we were evicted. Papa and I packed everything in a big truck with nowhere to go. Papa said, let's have lunch to cheer me up. My stomach wasn't feeling so good, but anyway, we went to eat. Sakai-san was there at the restaurant too and asked about the truck in front. That's how we moved into a room in the back of the Uoki fish store on Post. It was a room where the employees went for breaks and naps, very cramped, smell of fish. During the day, I took care of Shizu, Sakai-san's baby daughter. That was temporary. Next, we moved to an apartment down the same street. Same thing. I cleaned it up and we were evicted again. So much discrimination. Finally, Papa found a house on Sutter for $35 a month. Too expensive, I thought, but Papa rented the extra rooms to others, a koto teacher, a painter, and a shop worker. Their rent paid for everything. Papa chose a big room for his studio with a smaller room next to it for our bedroom. That first year of our marriage in March, I thought maybe I was pregnant, but in April, I was sure. So I told Papa. He said, well, this is going to be a problem. Get undressed right now. Women lose their shape after they get pregnant. I need to paint you before you lose your shape. Lose my shape. Look at me now. 4 children, first Kimio, then Fujiko, then Gyo, then Yuri. Have I lost my shape? Well, of course I have, but what sort of response is that? That is what it was to marry an artist. But Papa was resourceful and smart to use his talent to support our family, drawing for books and magazines, making the backdrop for window scenes at Gump's. Even the grand scenes of opera, Madama Butterfly. Well, in my opinion, a silly story, but never before did they have such authentic scenes. And at every chance, he took all of us away to places where the children could play and he could paint and draw. For many summers, we stayed in a farm in Santa Cruz in the redwood forest with trips to the beach. You know the scenes Papa painted, all famous now, like Hiroshige in California. You see the ancient redwoods, their branches bending to earth, the twilight softening and making that misty glow, wispy fog in the warm air around the pure blackness of the hair. One night, the farmer at the house in Santa Cruz began to cough blood, and Papa ran through the dark woods to find help. He thought, my friend is dying. His spirit guides me by moonlight. See where he paints wet on wet, his hand guiding 3 different brushes to make that glow, precisely, deftly, with each breath. He cannot make any mistakes. My son Kimio inside of me then must have known our arguments. What was Papa going to do with his naked paintings of me? He argued, all wives of artists pose nude. Nude, as if this was my duty. Scandalous, how embarrassing. I would not become a spectacle in public. Over many days, we argued and argued. I refused, he pleaded. I will make a painting to preserve your beauty. Such nonsense. One day we got the letter to say that Rokuichi had died. He was both Papa's father and brother. This is the complication of yoshi practice in Japan. A family's name must continue with its property and legacy. So Rokuichi married into a family in Sendai and took their name. Then he took his younger brother to be his adopted son. The story is that Rokuichi practically captured his little brother, and Papa went screaming and crying from his birth mother and home in Okayama. Who is to say where and from whom we've come? Papa is known by his name, and it will always be so. When Rokuichi died, Papa decided we must all go to Japan. Kimio Fujiko Gyo Yuri ni. Papa painted, showed his work, oversaw a series of woodcuts of his California scenes. He wanted to show California as he saw it. Kimio missed his friends and left early to return to high school in San Francisco. Papa, who had run away from home himself, thought this was best. The rest of us learned to live in Japan, but it was not forever. After 2 years and before we left Japan, I took Fujiko to my mother's home in Fukuoka. Maybe Fujiko, even at 13 with a child's mind, so sweet and innocent, understood or perhaps not. I placed 3 baran okama in her hands, embraced her for one last time, and turned away. I could not show my tears and heartbreak. When I was a good distance from the house, I could finally look back without showing my distress. I saw Fujiko sitting, facing the garden, her legs dangling over the wooden deck, extending from our old house, twirling those leaves. Papa said, "No one will see this painting, but I must paint it." Papa made a big easel for his sketches. He unwrapped a special piece of silk woven from the first spring threads of the finest silkworms. He stretched this precious silk over a giant frame that almost filled our room. He dissolved a special glue made from deer hide, carefully simmering it in water, then straining it through the gauze to remove all impurities. Into this nikuwasui, he added finely ground hydrated alum. This solution, this dosa, with a thin flat brush, he then spread tenderly over the silk surface. He prepared the paints, got oyster shells from Uoki, smashed and ground them into fine white paint. This, he said, to paint your soft skin. He separated his best sumi and sent for special colors from Japan. This was paint made from stones like lapis lazuli or crystal agate, also coral and flowers. Finally, he prepared his special brushes made from the hair of deer, rabbit, badger, bear, fox, and cat. He placed the silk frame with its empty white surface on the floor and readied 3 brushes in his hand like chopsticks. Nothing more to argue. Every night, we close the windows, the curtains, close the doors, many nights. And thanks to these folks for their critical comments, and especially thanks to Kimmy Hill and the Obata family, and your sister Mia is here, right? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for permission to share the paintings and the photographs of the Chiura and Haruko Obata archive. Thank you.
I'll talk a little bit about my songs, and I'm inspired by Karen.
Yeah, there you go.
First off, I want to thank all the folks who were responsible for putting the event on. I don't have my list here. And especially I wanted to thank Karen for allowing me to be part of the program. This is all part of her program for a whole week in residence. And, I've been a very big admirer of Karen's for a long time. I originally started out as a singer-songwriter. That was my early ambition. And I sang songs about being Asian American, these original songs. And this was sort of in the mid-70s to the early 70s. And I was recording songs and trying to get a record contract. And if you can imagine, at that time, singing songs about being Asian American, all American Asian punk, Ballad of the East Bay.
Yeah.
These didn't go over really well with the record companies. Nonetheless, kept singing, and there were some other contemporaries with Peter Horikoshi. Michael Only was involved in that scene also. We were doing music together, and I'm going to sing a little bit of one song because Karen has raised the bar. All right. Lambrusco.
So good.
All right. Ambling down the avenue, scuffling in the street. I'm the worst of the West, mixed with the worst of the East. And I've never been to China, but I've been to San Jose. And it ain't exactly Asia, but it's my home anyway. And I'm angry, it's true. And you would be too, if you knew about the damage that they do. And I say, God damn, here I make my stand like my grandpa. Before I'm a truck farming man, and I'll be trucking and chucking through the jiving and junk of just your all-American Asian punk. Also, there's a CD that Peter Horikoshi put together of a concert I did with David Henry Wong and a bunch of other musicians, and it's available at
YokohamaCA.com.
Yokohama, California,
CA.
CA.com.
Oh, that's good.
So we can get our plugs in. So
Yeah. This is it, right? No,
that's it
no.
right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And East Wind Books.
East Wind Books.
Yes.
All right. The other thing is, in terms of my career as a singer-songwriter, it kind of ended on a moment of epiphany where I was singing in North Beach. I told the story before, it's true. I was singing in North Beach, and because you have these things where you sign up, and it's sort of like open mic night. So you get there early, and you sign up, and then you go on stage and you have like 10 minutes to show your wares to this audience. So I was in this one club, and this is at the time when Carol Doda was quite big in North Beach. There were many strip clubs all along there. And so I was up, and I was on stage, and I was singing my little yellow heart out, Ballad of the East Bay, All American Asian Dream. And of course, no one was listening. I mean, literally, there's all this noise and people are drinking. No one was paying attention. Yet I was determined. In my little heart, I was going to keep on singing these songs and make them pay attention. Then at one moment, a stripper from next door came into the club. And nothing against her, everyone has to make a living. And she started to walk up the aisle, middle aisle, towards where I was singing. And she started swaying to my music, and then stood in front of me and started dancing. And all the audience began to pay attention. And she was dancing, I was singing my little yellow soul out, and I thought, as I looked out over this crowd, I thought, this is fucked up. And I gave up my career trying to be a singer-songwriter. Another thing I've done over the years is I've tried to continually break the mold of what I do. So that in terms of being a Japanese American, Asian American writer, that it is something that you continually keep alive, break the mold, do other things. And so for myself, much like Karen has done, was continually written about and use different forms, different styles to kind of create. I also did that. So I've done films, and then most recently, I wanted to find another form to talk about the Japanese American story. And two things I knew was one, I didn't want to tell the same story in the same way. I've been writing about incarceration for almost 40 years. So for me as an artist, you have to find a new way to tell the story, or why do it? We have museums that take care of that already. So my thought was, I was going to do an opera, which I hadn't done, and I was going to use new music composition, which is to say, it's not your traditional opera. They use invented instruments. Their key signatures and are different. So I chose new opera, and also I chose the idea of why not track the idea of the psychological trauma caused rot that was brought upon Japanese Americans at that time, and then somehow link it to the present anti-Asian violence. And so what I used was this whole idea of the soil. It starts off in Stockton, the opera, where there was, all the Japanese American farmers that were going on, and that the soil itself, the peat dirt, was so rich that it could grow anything. So the trajectory of my opera libretto is that, America can grow anything. It can grow beans, it can grow potatoes, but it also can grow Executive Order 9066. It can also grow racism. And that it kind of tracks through this whole idea that whatever caused the incarceration still exists in the soil. And it just takes the right amount of whatever to cause it to grow again. And so the opera kind of tracks that through with the idea that all the anti-Asian violence now is just part of the same thing that's been in the soil the whole time. So the story focuses on peat dirt and uses that as a kind of metaphor. So this is just a bit of the beginning of it.
I grow beans.
Yes, I know, but what else do you do?
Tomatoes, peppers, potatoes.
I mean in your spare time, after work. Do you like music? What kind of music do you listen to?
Mrs. Okubo told you I was a farmer. That's what I do. I am suspended below the earth and above the sky.
both so much. I am actually, out of respect for your creative process, which clearly is not linear, we're gonna go out of order. If that's all right with you both. I'm wondering if we could maybe start by hearing a bit more about your creative process, right? How do you get to the point of what you've shown us today? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
No.
Okay. This particular piece is part of what I was talking about earlier, that as an artist, at various points, you have to kind of break the mold. You work so hard learning the craft so that whatever is internal, whatever this voice is that you've been feeding through everything, it doesn't come out with the same thing over and over. You work so hard to master craft. So for me, every once in a while, periodically, I break the mold. There was one point where I felt, well, I was hired to write a 3-part miniseries for public television. And I thought I could do it, but I was having a real hard time, and the due date was coming up. 3-part series about Japan's industry, auto industry coming to America. So I told Diane, I'm going to hole myself up at the New Otani Hotel, stay there for a week, never leave the room, and when I come out, I'm going to have it. I think I'd seen too many movies or something like that. So after about 3 days, I called Diane up and said, and I had food sitting all around, and my hair was like, and I said, I can't do this. I failed, and I'd never failed before. So I took around 9 months off, sat around the house, and then I decided to keep myself alive creatively. I was going to force myself to do other things that would put me in a position of kind of sink or swim, or having to come up with something to allow myself to move forward, hopefully with new information and new product. So at that time, I decided to make a film. I'd never made a film before, and I ended up playing the lead. And it was a short film, but the whole point is, I put it all together myself, raised the money, and that opened a whole new sort of avenue for me. The other was I did a one-person spoken word show, backed up by a bunch of alley jazz musicians, Hiroshima, all those folks. And so we did that also, and I'd never performed on stage before. So basically what it is, to crack myself open again, I force myself to do other things that almost kind of make me feel, in danger, what I can call it. So the opera was also the same thing, where I just felt I needed a new way of kind of talking about things. And I needed a new way of talking about things I talked about before, because again, as an artist, it always has to be fresh. It doesn't matter if it's an important issue, it has to be fresh and alive coming out. And so that's what led me to do an opera and work with new music. I think you notice in there, there's a fellow in the background playing an invented instrument called the marimba lumina. And he's part of the Paul Drescher ensemble. And basically it's like a xylophone that's programmed with a variety of sounds. And so he kind of is playing like the ocean, chorus, while he's also playing other notes. So just working with him really kind of allowed me to, again, just open up, kind of get excited again.
Well, it seems like your work, because it's theater, is always collaborative, and you're working with others. And so part of your process, I think, has to do with the collaboration. And that's also the risk that you take too. And, giving up,
Yep.
and
Yeah.
letting others take over and move in and out. So how does that work?
Well, I think what I do is I'd like to ask you, how does it work for you? Because again, you've
All right.
done so many different things. So your creative process.
Well, when I tried to work in theater,
Yes.
I love theater. I
I know.
mean, I grew up going to theater with my family, and
Mhm.
I have a great love for it. And I always thought that at one point that would be my dream to have something staged. But it's not so easy, and so I really admire you that
Mhm.
you have kept engaging in it, because it was like, what do they say, herding cats. Now, and working with others. And so I had to give up. If I made a narrative, I had to give it up to the actors to interpret it. And I had to let them,
Mhm.
become whatever it was going to be. It might not have been exactly my vision. And I came back to the United States at a time when I was going to work with East-West players.
Mhm.
Again, I thought.
Yeah.
And Mako was kicked out of the East-West Players
Yeah.
Institute. And that was this whole political scene. And my work was tied to working with Shizuko Hoshi, his wife,
Oh,
and their
that's right,
family.
yeah.
And they were, so my stuff got kicked out of
Oh, that's
the
right.
possibility for having a venue. And so we had to find venues outside. And Shizuko and I and Vicky Abe and Kara Maeda, the others who worked
Mhm.
with me, we had to go and find other places. And that's why I had such a short life for all of my, and I
Yeah.
couldn't do it anymore. I mean, all this stuff was in our garage. We couldn't park a car there. And there was this big set piece that, what is his first name, Tashima? Chris Tashima had, under tarp on his tennis court, so they can play tennis. So that went on, and so I got tired of. I couldn't do it anymore.
But you did do one called Omen.
Yeah,
Because when I came to East West Players, or after, I'm not sure when.
he did the Avocado Kid, and I did Oh Man.
Yeah.
About the same time.
Yes.
Before or after?
We're not even sure.
We're not sure.
What came
Yeah.
first, the chicken or the egg?
And we should talk about how we know each other so long.
Well, we sort of met. Well, I was.
wanted you to ask that, so.
Yeah. Right.
No,
It's fine.
good.
It's good.
I was seeing a woman who was your good friend from high school.
From my friend from high school.
And
Can I say her name?
Sure, yeah.
Kathy Bonai. And Kathy Bonai and great friends. And she went off to UC Santa Barbara
Mm-hmm.
and then to Hastings. Did you meet her at Hastings or UC Santa
UC
Barbara?
Santa Barbara.
So one day she drives up with you, and and she would come all the time. My father loved Kathy Bonai because he said she had a joie de vivre, that she was always happy and positive.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and both of you came in, and he was very happy to meet you because you also had that wonderful smile on your face. And he was a real punk. I was meeting him for the first time, and Kathy said, "Well, could you meet?" I go, "Oh." And then it turned out that you were doing the Avocado Kid over at East West. But I was living in Brazil in those years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I never got to see your show, and I always thought, "Oh, I missed it," because I wanted to see how a peach turns into avocado.
That adaptation. Well, I remember thinking that Catherine Bonai had said, "I want you to meet my friend. You remind me of my friend, like really creative and thinking about stuff." And so that was how she described you. And it's sort of interesting that we did, kind of track parallel themes, like Godzilla.
So you did a play about Godzilla, and you were collecting. You're a collector of Godzilla.
I have a really big one that's sort of like, it's really cool.
Really, yeah, and And it's, yeah, then I worked on this musical with Vicky Abbott called Godzilla Comes to Little Tokyo. We had a very short run up in Seattle. But I was fascinated with Godzilla and I was watching all the films and yeah. But I never knew you. And then I don't know how I found out that you were collecting Godzilla and then you did a play.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Remember and like, you
and
know.
I never saw the play.
Okay.
And you never saw mine.
No, I didn't.
But yeah. Yeah, but we were doing these things.
Then the other one was Chang'ening and I Hotel, kind of like.
Right. So I became fascinated with the Siamese twins.
Yeah.
And that was I don't know, yeah. And I read everything about Siamese twins. And then many years later, I was at UC Santa Cruz and you brought a play to UC Santa Cruz on stage. And what is it? It's Chang'ening. Like, wow. Why haven't we been having these, conversations? Because we could have collaborated and done work together all these years because we have the same fascination.
Yeah.
And Chang'ening, yeah, we could talk about it forever.
Yeah, I mean, from Godzilla
To Chang'ening.
to Chang'ening.
Yeah.
And then in the most recently, the I Hotel.
The I Hotel.
Yeah, we both wrote about that.
Right.
So.
Right. And I put Chang'ening in the I Hotel.
You did?
Yes.
Wow, but that's so cool that you would do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I did.
Kind of conflating certain kind of themes and then allowing that to actually do speculation, sort
Right.
of
So
open up the window.
I don't know. So when you're talking about process, I don't know how to answer that because I understand what he's doing and I understand what he's saying, but process, there's process, but there's also the imagination and then whatever it is you're working on and fascinated about at the moment. Yeah.
Although I think when we spoke earlier, you had also talked about the influence of your childhood and family stories, right? Your communities that you grew up in as sort of influencing factors in not only form, but also content. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about that as well.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, he's from Stockton.
And that explains everything. She's from Gardena. That explains everything.
Yeah. So I don't know that much about Stockton, but I know a little because my cousin lives there now.
Really?
Yeah, Kenneth Yamashita. He lives there with his partner.
And where do they live?
I don't know.
I'm not to exclude you from the conversation. Where in Stockton do
I
they
don't
live?
know. Somewhere where I don't know. But Gardena, in the years that my father had a stroke and he was a Methodist minister at Centenary Methodist. And after his stroke, he took disability. He really couldn't really work anymore, so he became a house husband and my mother went to work as a school teacher and she became the breadwinner. But we had to leave the parsonage in central LA. We lived near USC in those years. And then we lived on the west side in the Crenshaw district. And so we moved to Gardena. So I moved about the time, high school, I moved to Gardena. And Gardena, but I figured out that I moved from these small Japanese American communities, the Japanese American community in central LA, and then in the west side of LA, and then in Gardena.
Mm-hmm.
And they were kind of enclosed provincial spaces, which were post-war camps.
Yeah.
In a sense,
Yeah.
and people were gathered there, of course, because of racial covenants in the city.
Yep.
So you couldn't live just anywhere. And so, of course, we were grouped in these places. And there was people brought all their baggage from camp, and all of their experiences and their politics. And I didn't know that, but I grew up in those spaces. And so I think, that influenced me. And Catherine Bonai, her father was,
Real estate, then he was a
what was it?
politician.
Is it Paul Bonai? Well,
Paul, yeah.
yeah, and he was in real estate. And he was a very important person in the Gardena community because he, as a real estate agent, he sold houses to other Japanese Americans. And so we could all
Yeah.
live together
Yeah,
happily.
that's interesting. That's interesting, yeah.
Happily.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then wasn't Paul Bonai, didn't he become a supervisor?
yeah.
Or
state
was he a
assembly.
mayor for state assembly?
Yeah.
So he ran for office.
Yeah,
And so there was political capital in being a real estate person in those years. And but it created this enclave.
what did that afford you in terms of freedom or conditional freedom or?
I think, yeah, what do you think? I mean, we're in television.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
well, I was just thinking Stockton afforded me a kind of conditional
Mhm.
freedom. Stockton's really interesting. Pre-war, World War II, it was a huge Japanese American community, vibrant, just the whole everything. It was a whole world and universe that was functioning, and also part of the agricultural scene, which was really important to California. I think what happened is when I grew up, by the time I grew up, this is post camps. Stockton, where all the people that were in Roar, Arkansas, came back and decided they were going to live in Stockton. And one of the things I became aware of was that the Japanese American community was one thing, but when you left it, the world was another thing. And I remember a couple of incidences that I think, show what kind of world I was living in. At one point, we moved to an all-white neighborhood
In Stockton.
in Stockton
Mhm.
from a mixed neighborhood. We went to my mother was really, education was really critical.
So you wanted to go to better schools.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so I would come home with all my white friends and, I'd be playing with them. They'd be outside waiting for me. And then I'd come inside and my mother would go, Philip, you could have white friends. You can play with them and do things together. But if anything bad happens, they'll turn on you. Now go play. But that summed up basically her take on America, white America, what had been done to her. And it really created this kind of weird kind of sense of self-hate, wanting to be beyond or more than Japanese America because it was less than. And then being really aware of race in terms of white America. So I always talk about, I used to have this little camera or like a little thing in the back of your head. And when you're in Japan, the Japanese American culture, you're safe. It's like you're fine, everything. But when you go outside of that, you have this thing that says, what is the situation like? Is it safe? Is it unsafe? Is it kind of like I can be myself or I can't be myself? Is it like, are these white folks that are cool? Are these white folks that maybe are bad? Are these white folks that are kind of, you don't know what they're going to do? So you have this kind of camera or little kind of radar that wherever I went, I was always measuring the situation. And you do it unconsciously. And that came from growing up in Stockton, which I think was much more racist, I think, maybe institutionally than Gardena. I used to dream about living in Gardena where everyone was Japanese American. I thought this would be like heaven. I did. Yeah, which was not the case.
Well, okay. So growing up within the Japanese community, my father was a Methodist minister, so I was supposed to be the good kid. And so that was hard.
It's a burden.
there's a burden. So, and then I would join clubs and they would make me the chaplain, things like that. And so I was always like, and then, so there's a confinement there, but also when I got into junior high school and high school, there were all these cliques of girls. And I could never get into the cool clique. I was always in the nerdy clique, or I was just by myself. And I was sort of always a stranger in my own community. But I thought this is just normal. And so in some ways I could feel the ostracism within my own community about what I could do or wanted to do. And then we always have those complaints about that people compare their children and they say things, and that was always uncomfortable. But I was always sort of outside of that, and I really but my parents, my father being a minister in the church, and also his ideas about civil rights and the way he thought politically about the country and a place it should be. I mean, he thought we should, be out there with all sorts of folks.
Yeah.
And my father and my mother would never have said what you understood.
That's interesting. Totally, yeah.
That was not it. And when it came time for me to go to school, to leave to go to college, they actually actively said, please leave California. Go to school outside of California and go to a small liberal arts college somewhere where you will be in small, classes with friendly conditions. And they were suggesting all. So in the end, I went to Carleton College, but I applied to a lot of colleges outside. And they knew the colleges because my aunt had worked with the student relocation and with the Quakers. And I ended up at Carleton College because John Nason was her boss in student relocations in Old Quaker. He was the director of student relocation. The other idea was also to see something outside of California and see the world. So they thought, well, if you have to dip out and understand the world, maybe you need to be in the white world, in a place where you're by yourself and swim. And I didn't know that at the time, but I think that's what they thought.
Well, speaking of being outside the world, right, or in the world, you both spent some time in Japan at different times, of course. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about those experiences in Japan and how that perhaps influenced your understanding of what it means to be Japanese American.
Well, for me, I went to UC Santa Cruz in 1969.
You did?
You didn't know that?
I didn't know that. I thought you went to
Banana
Santa
slugs.
Barbara. You're a banana.
All the way.
All coming full circle. Where?
No, I went to Crown
You were crowned.
because I wanted to be a doctor.
Oh, okay.
But I was still interested in bands and rock and roll, and I started doing pottery too at UC Santa Cruz, and then
There's a kiln over there.
yeah, and I got the opportunity to go to Japan, the junior year abroad.
Okay. What year were you there?
I was there 69.
Oh, before me.
Yeah, and
Okay.
like some interesting folks went there, like Kent Nagano was there. Did you ever run into him at all?
Ken Nagano was there, but that's before me too.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't go there. I taught there.
Okay, yeah. Oh. Well, I did not have a good time there. I just felt I was getting high all the time.
So you're having a good time.
Well, it was okay. I felt a little kind of like I couldn't quite feel what was going on. And also, actually, Nick, Doug, you die. I had my first acid trip. I talked about that. It takes place in sort of like out in the Santa Cruz, kind of outside the campus, where they used to have cows and
Oh, yeah, we
whatnot.
still have power.
Yeah, well, figures prominently in my story. Yeah.
Yeah.
What were you talking about?
Well, you're talking about Japan.
Oh,
Japan.
Japan. Like, take that away. Yeah. Give me that. Just the idea that I got a chance to go to Japan, and when I went there, I actually fell in love with the pottery immediately. So I left the program and I found a place to study pottery, and I studied in the not studied. I was a apprentice for like a year and a half in this pottery village, and about 1 year into my stay there, I had to do business in Tokyo. So it was a long train ride. I took it all the way back into Tokyo. And I had been in Japan long enough and living in the village, Mashiko, long enough that I spoke the language well enough. My clothing no longer looked odd, and my gestures were no longer weird. They were contained, you know? And so I went back to, yeah, not me, but I went to Tokyo. In Tokyo, I remember coming out of the subway, and I think it was in Shibuya or one of these places, but I came up and I was hit by a sea of faces. I've been living in a small country place. So I was hit by the sea of faces. And at that time, they all looked like me. They all had the same color hair, you know, and as I looked around on the billboards, on the television, the baseball player doing the cigarette commercial, they all looked just like me. And I remember walking along in this crowded sort of group of people, and that I began to feel kind of this, as if I were buoyed. I literally felt as if something kind of fell away, and I was being buoyed along, and I didn't have to work to move. I didn't have to work to belong. And it was the weirdest sensation and an epiphany that kind of changed the course of my life, because I realized what it was is this was like the mantle of racism that I grew up with in Stockton that always forced me to have to look out and measure everything I entered into. And that at that moment, I felt what it was like to be part of the majority, to exist in the center, and to be able just to, everything in the entire world reinforced me. And that, when I came back to Mashiko, I realized, oh, that's what that was. And I was able to kind of put perspective. One is, I'm not Japanese. I realize that, you know, you're not. But in that instant, I had a chance to see what it meant to live in America and Stockton growing up. And that changed the course of my life. I came back to the States and began to pursue this whole thing of being an Asian American, Japanese American.
Well, before that, what were you? You were Stockton White?
Yeah, I was. You know, I mean, I didn't know. I didn't know I could write stories like that. I can't. See, again, I grew up in Stockton.
Okay.
My mother used to say, like, you can't, you know, like this story, no one's going to look at it. I mean, no one's going to read it. You know, you can't write stories with a Japanese American central character. I mean, yeah. I mean, she was really well-meaning, but she grew up in Stockton, having been incarcerated.
Well, you know, my feeling about Japan is that you felt that because you're a guy. And
Interesting. Yeah.
Because I, as a woman, I get it. I got it. And I became Japanese, and I did all this whole thing, and I could, but it was an erasure of myself entirely. But also it was gendered in a way that I had to be Japanese woman. I also had to speak in a language. I was faking it all the time, but and I could get through certain parts of it, but after a while, I think it was. I had to wake from that whole thing where
How long were you there?
I was there for about a year and almost a year and a half.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
Right. But my Japanese never got that great, but and one of the things that I
was troubling to me about learning Japanese, so you gotta learn 2,000 characters.
I wouldn't
I don't know
know
how
that.
Andrew does it, but yeah, but that, and then I had to learn a kind of Japanese, which would be feminine, but then there were not enough people to talk to me in order to help me, develop a more sophisticated vocabulary. So I felt that, I could never get the vocabulary to speak more sophisticated. So, I was talking like a child the whole time. And I after a while, I can't do that. So I could tell you a story about what happened to me.
Yeah.
Is that I had shed all my clothing. I got rid of my glasses. I got contact lens. I let my hair grow because it was short like this. I had it grow, and I got Japanese clothing. I bought all this stuff. In those days, they had little platforms and all that. And so I covered myself up because I didn't like to go into the trains because guys would touch you all the time. It's horrible. And so there I was, and my sister was coming to the same program. And she gets off the plane, and I go get her, and she's got this tan, she's looking so beautiful. Her hair is long, she's looking like the sunset you want to be. And she's got this little white, it's short, it's a little light sunsuit, it's a little suit. And she's kind of showing there, and she's, oh my God, she goes, I was like, oh. And I say, okay, but I want to tell her, this is the problem, the way you're dressed. They're gonna feel you up, but it's like, so we get on the train, and they have the train stops, right?
Yeah.
And you can't get in the train. So what they do is they got these guys with gloves and they push you in. So my sister gets pushed in, and then I go get in, and she's looking at me, turning around, looking out, and the door closes in front of it. And she goes, and I say, just get off at the next stop. I'm gonna get you. So that was our experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get on to finally we get that. There was one moment in which we were in the train, and she says to me, Katie, my feet are not on the floor. That's what she was pushed up. It was hilarious. And I'm going, okay. And she says, and then she was really mad at somebody was, well, it was like, if your feet is on the floor, of course, some guy's behind you. So we run out. I said, we're going to get out here. She's over there, and said, and some guy is messing with her. So she turns around, and she grabs him like, she says, yo. And I don't know what she says, but anyway, she pushes him into the crowd. He falls back, and all these people fall back, and we run out of there, and just laughing. And I just thought, oh my God, I gotta get out of here.
Yeah, that was your moment.
That was my moment, and but my poor sister had to live another year there and figure it out. But yeah.
What program was that?
Oh, it's a Waseda program.
Oh, the Waseda one. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. It's fun.
Kinda.
Yeah. So that was Japan. But yeah, but you learned a whole. That's beautiful.
Yeah,
and
that
then
sounds very different.
Yeah, and then of course you put that in your plays, and that's a beautiful part of one of your plays.
The pottery part.
The pottery,
Yeah,
and that's. Mm-hmm.
So we're at 7:15, and I know that we've got a few questions, but I did want to sneak in one quick question, the last one that we talked about, and that was, we'd ended our last conversation that we had in prep for this, talking about your reason for writing, right? And especially on Japanese American topics. And you spoke specifically, I think both of you, about the importance of healing through your work. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about that, how you pursue that in your work. You
You
don't
wanna-
remember? You had too much wine?
Really? I know you could prove it that we talked.
You did talk about that.
Really? I mean, do you remember that? I don't know. You can pretend like we don't remember.
It was related to
Yeah.
your hopes for the community, right, in general terms.
Well, you know, when I started writing, I was really writing about the Japanese Brazilian immigration, and that's what I was interested in. I was interested in bringing that story to, you know, a new group of people, because I was so surprised that that's the largest community of descendants you know, that's the largest immigration in the world outside of Japan. And and I was interested in the comparative look at that and what that meant what it meant. And also because I had learned with that community a different way culturally of being Japanese, because Japanese Brazilians, they're a lot of fun.
Compared to Japanese Americans.
Yeah, Japanese, well, you know, we're a little staid, and we you know, and Japanese Brazilians are always hugging and kissing each other, and anyway, they're a lot of fun. And I learned to be more comfortable in my body when I was in Brazil in many ways after being in Japan, and then so I had that experience. But unlike your mother who said that, my mother never wanted me to write about our family, never. And when I did write something, she went to the Rafa Shimbu, and Frank Truman was the editor there, and she said, "Give me that." And she grabbed it out of the
Seriously, whoa!
and took it back, and then she wrote me a long letter about why I shouldn't write about my family, and that it would be embarrassing and all of that. So I never wrote again about my family, and I found subjects outside of my family to talk about. And so it's only very recently that I started to write about my family and this community. And so,
Yes,
yeah,
these books.
and I didn't write this until on my father's side, all the siblings have died. And on my mother's side as well, last year, the last sibling died. I don't know, maybe my cousins will kill me now. So, yeah, so I had to go find other subjects. And so that's also been about my process, has been to research other subjects, other communities, other things. And so that's clearly what that's about. But in this process of looking at the stories of my family in relationship to the internment, because Letters to Memory is really about the letters that my cousins and I all found, and were the letters that our parents wrote to each other during the war.
That's really
And
cool.
so we
That's
were
right.
able to pull these all together and kind of piece together a story based on these letters from the end of the 1930s through the war, and then a little after the war. And so I wanted to answer and look at these letters and think about all the gaps in them, and flush all that out, and think about the relationship of that story to the civil rights movement. So my change in talking about the internment was to really look at its relationship to civil rights and what my family had to do with that. And I think that was, for me, a way of reconciling, well, the fact that I could never tell these stories, but also to find out about them, and also to think about them in relation to a larger community in question of civil rights and justice. And that's maybe the healing that we're talking about.
Thank you.
You know, my journey is actually sort of the opposite, in that I've been writing about Japanese America, and right from the beginning, I always felt the Japanese American story in and of itself was not enough. And it had to be about its relationship to the rest of the world and the rest of America. So early on, one of the things I explored was the kind of intersectionality of Japanese Americans, Asian Americans, and Black Americans. So one of my earliest pieces was called Yohen, and it's about interracial couple in Gardena, might have been Gardena, or probably San Pedro,
Not Stockton?
not Stockton. Well, it's interesting, there were so many instances of Black GIs marrying Japanese women that this is post-war, during the post-war period. They actually moved them all together to two places. They moved them to Oakland and they moved them to San Pedro. So I happen to be good friends with someone who came from San Pedro, is biracial. Another friend that I know now came from the Oakland kind of community, but just the idea of I don't know, what was I? What was that? I was talking about the idea of different themes to write about.
Right.
Basically, I've been writing about the intersection of Japanese Americans and Black Americans. I've done it progressively to the point, most recently I did one called After the War.
That's right.
It's in San Francisco. It's about that period when post-World War II, the whole Fillmore district, Western Addition, all those folks were there, moved into the vacuum that occurred in Japantown. This happened in Little Tokyo also. And the idea that Japanese Americans get out of camp, they come back to this particular community and they want their place back. And what happens when these two kind of intersect? The reason why I did that, I continue to do that, is because I felt, given the state of the country, you have to write about the intersectionality, because otherwise it doesn't matter anymore. There's so much going on that has to do with this kind of intersection, butting up against each other. What I found recently, though, it's sort of is that me writing about those issues, as much as I worked to kind of make sure that the Black American point of view was represented, I think is being sort of in some ways looked at as being not enough. And that so much is happening in the world that the stories I try to write about the intersectionality are kind of looked at in a way that perhaps says, I don't know if this is really kind of an appropriate story or does full justice to the world. And I began to think, I am ultimately writing from a Japanese American perspective. There's no way to get around it. But I kept thinking, isn't there still value in that? I mean, or is this part of this whole thing of where somehow Asian Americans are seen as white adjacent? And that somehow in that moment of intersection, their experiences are not worthy or appropriate. So I'm at a place where I'm not quite sure how to treat that and how to move forward writing about that particular issue. But I do get a strong sense of, I now say my plays are Changineng, are about two biracial kind of Asian Americans in the center, and around them orbit a variety of characters. One of them is a slave. But to set it up from the beginning to say that this isn't about other ancillary characters, as important as their story is in America. This starts with these two Thai Chinese twins at the center. So please look at the literature from that point of view, and don't expect me to write the story you may want, as important as it is, because I'm writing it from this perspective. And that's been really a tricky thing to negotiate right now. And I'm not sure how to proceed.
I can't help.
Yeah, I know, again, it's a whole different kind of take on that. And, I have worked with sort of many of the really important Black artists like Danny Glover and, Carl Lumley and stuff. that is a challenge.
But those collaborations are, are important, and I'm sure that
I think they are.
they'll produce some.
Also,
Yeah.
so what's interesting is that both of them are from the 60s.
Mhm.
Danny Glover was part of the movement, in
Yeah,
San
he
Francisco
was.
State, and they brought with them, as well as another collaborator of mine, Stephen Anthony Jones.
Mhm.
They're from a certain era that's so thought of in terms of the third world, and I think it's because of that they're more kind of open, or perhaps old school, so that their point of view is a little more inclusive, or forgiving, or something. I think I'm trying to figure that one out also.
Is this a good time to maybe there's answers
Okay,
to that? Or
yeah,
responses to
sure.
that in the audience? Would it
Mhm.
be okay to ask? Yes.
Well, I really am absolutely fascinated by your story. And there's a certain parallel in our culture. We're from the Netherlands. And I grew up in Ripon. Of course, you grew in Stockton. And
Yeah.
we had our own church, we had our own school, and we had absolutely nothing to do with Americans. And my mother would say, always watch the Americans because, they'll do bad things to you. So
Yeah.
it's a very interesting thing is we never trusted anyone that wasn't Dutch. And,
Yeah.
if you didn't finish your plate, my mother would say, well, what are you, an American? That's what Americans do. Thank you. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Other questions? And Max, I'm going to have to ask you to help me out if there's virtual questions on the Zoom. No, okay. Yes.
I'm wondering if either of you had any revelations about Japanese perspectives around the Second World War, because there's all sorts of complexities, right? With the bombs and so how did you feel as Japanese Americans? And my understanding is that back then the whole concept of Japanese American was not even formed. So how did you negotiate political conversations?
Right. Yeah, that one.
Well, I don't know if I had political conversations in Japan. I wasn't sophisticated enough to have those conversations, probably, especially in Japanese, unless I had them in English. But my mother and my mother's family were from Matsumoto in Nagano-ken, and they had very strong ties to her family. Especially in after the war, but also during the war. They couldn't write to each other. But as soon as my grandmother, they're the Sakais, they're Oki Sakai. If you were ever in Nihonmachi, that's the Sakai grocery store, the fish market. And as soon as they came back to Nihonmachi, to Japantown, that she would create boxes of food, and she was sending it constantly to the family there. And also, so when I met with that family, I heard what their stories about the war and what happened post-war, and their gratitude to my grandparents for sending them food, because that's what they were able to live on, and they were able to sell it on the black market in order to buy other things. So those ties were very strong. Yeah.
The whole idea in terms of Korean American and Japanese American, especially in terms of the more information that's come out, the more discussion involving sort of the kind of atrocities that happened and the comfort women. All those issues now are very much part of what's going on. The demographics have changed also. So, you're hard pressed to find a Japanese American on campus. It's sort of like, what is that story? As opposed to Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, Koreans, Um, just two examples. One is I was doing a play, and this has to do with sort of theater. I had a woman actress named Kim Yoon-jun, playing Yachio, a Japanese American issei in my play. And I'm not quite sure how to explain this, but she was doing the portrayal of this issei, Japanese American woman in Hawaii. And every time we came to a very hot emotional topic, I felt she was too strong. It had to be muted. It had to be kind of like muted and pulled in. And we had discussions about this. And I finally realized, we're all coming from different places. And this is an Asian American play now. And it's being portrayed, it's a Japanese American story, but we have a Korean American, or like in Both Eyes Open, the male singer is from South Korea. And that they bring to it kind of a different point of view, and it's an interpretation of something that may have started as Japanese American. Both Eyes Open, bringing up to speed. There was one, we were kind of auditioning people, and the person we have now is Korean. But prior to that, we interviewed one person, and he said to me, I'm Korean, and my family does not like Japanese people. And, we know the history involved here, so I'm not quite sure I can be in this play. That is now part of the kind of the landscape and terrain, and it's certainly totally justified given the history which you focus on. And so
So that's very interesting, because I noticed when you open the opera, each of the characters tell their own who they are personally and how they identify, and they say, and I'm representing this character.
yeah,
And you did that purposely.
purposely, yeah. So like they say I am Korean from South Korea, and I'm playing the role of Jinzo Matsumoto. The other woman says I'm biracial, half Cambodian, half American, and I am playing the role of Catherine Matsumoto. Again, the idea is, let's put everything out there on the table, and you be aware of, you have all the information now to look at this piece, which has to do thematically with the Japanese American story. But now we all know the information, we're not trying to hide it, so let's all kind of, lean into the story with that information. And it's a very conscious thing I did, because it's problematic,
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
Wow, more questions.
Okay.
Are you okay? We're at time, but are you okay to take a couple more, and then
Of course.
is that all right, Mark? I think I saw a hand here, Peter, and then we'll go to this side.
Given all the parallels that you both discussed, how your careers have been sort of, heading in the same direction and known of each other, but you've never actually worked together. When are you going to work?
Well, we were sitting here going, first comparing our scarves. And we're going like, we have cool scarves. Then we began talking about shoes, and if you notice, we have really cool shoes, so it's only a matter of time. Yeah.
We're looking forward.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Peter.
2 questions over here.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Meg. I'm a grad student here, and I teach a course on genres of the Asian diaspora. I'm half Japanese, half Korean. You think was a forbidden mix. They guarantee each other. It's all good. But growing up, I was born here, and I also spent like 10 years in Japan. And I currently write. I write in Japanese about Gen Z in the U.S. and Asian American culture as well. And I find it really difficult to write these things in Japan because they have this victim mindset. They say really, it's still a very conservative country. very much in denial of imperialism. And, you know, my father was Nisei, Korean. My mom was first generation, but so none of my direct ancestors experienced the internment camps. But when I was in part of the scholarship program where they had American students and Japanese students go to the LA Museum of Japanese American History, none of the Japanese students knew anything about these internment camps, nothing. And, you know, as myself with this like complicated history, I relate more to the Japanese American experience than with the new Japanese diaspora. And I'm always really interested in hearing how Japanese Americans feel towards, you know, past Japanese government history and also how it continues today, because it's still, you know, that imperialism still very much continues today. So just if you have, you know, I'm just interested in your opinion about this political history and how you feel about, you know, Japanese government in general, like your roots, all that stuff, very complicated.
Well, you know, this gets into also, yeah, I think I need a whole bottle. You asked a really good question, a really complicated question too, and sort of gets into sort of what is Japanese America? Where did it come from? Where is it now? And where is it going? You know, and my sense would be that I'm more invested into the American story. I'm not Japanese. I've lived there a long time. I'm Japanese American. And a lot of things I realized and discovered about Japan are sort of not in keeping with my worldview. And that is fine. But it means that being Japanese American for me is to really know your history, track it all the way through. There's been so much like study, literature written, and then figure out where you are now, and then think in relationship to the whole issue in terms of Korean Americans. And it really, from my own point of view, it doesn't really include the Japanese that much anymore. I found that it's just not as relevant to me at this time. That's my point of view.
You want me to talk?
You,
Okay, well, my return to Japan was in the 90s. And I went to Japan actually to study the return migration of Brazilian Japanese to Japan. And that was, they called themselves the Dekasei. So, Japan, Brazil is in an economic slump, and young people who were getting out of college, they had no jobs in Brazil. So they went to Japan to work in factories because they could make more money there, and they were sending home money to their families. So I went to look at this phenomenon and this community of Brazilians who are living in Japan. And so I spent 6 months there interviewing, traveling, finding out about their lives there. And I wrote about it, and it's in a book over there called Circle K Cycles, which a friend of mine who's an anthropologist told me it's a fictional ethnography. But it does tell the story about this community. And I learned a great deal from this about immigration to Japan, their labor needs, and their relationship to Korean, Chinese, not just Brazilians, but Iranians and Persians, and many groups of people who are in Japan working, some of them legally and many of them illegally, because Japan is not producing young people to go into the workforce. So they need to bring immigrants in, but they don't want them at the same time. So I experienced the kind of prejudice that Japanese will, felt about Brazilians, even when the Brazilians looked like them. And so they knew very, very, and Japanese, they know very well. who belongs and who doesn't. And so it's always not a comfortable situation there. Certainly Korean, Japanese who are there, and they could be there for generations. They, you know, the Japanese are prejudiced, and that is a problem for to reveal that, you know.
Yeah.
So for marriages, for jobs, you might not be able to get them. Yeah.
There's more, and then there's more. There are films that are coming out now. There are various playwrights who are writing about that.
Well, Midi was here.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I was gonna
Midi
say,
was
yeah.
here, and that was she talked very frankly about her experiences, and well, she writes very actually tragically.
Yeah.
I think our last question, and then
I am a Chinese New Zealander, so it's really nice learning about the Asian American experience. I wanted to ask, as story writers, you're dealing with a very specific lived experience or community. Do you ever worry about feeling like you're exploiting a community story, especially when you can't mediate the interpretation from another audience who might come with their own biases or their own kind of perspectives? How do you both wrestle with that?
Well, I wrote the I Hotel, and I swam around many ethnic communities, and it was uneasy doing it, but I worked very hard to do my research and my homework, and to get buy-in from the people who were telling their stories to me. And I feel really responsible. Maybe they're mad at me, but they haven't said. But I wanted to be really responsible to their stories, and I tried very hard to do my homework, and that meant researching the history fully and taking more time than taking the most time possible to make sure that I did it right. We failed. But I don't know another way that story could be told, because what's Asian America, really?
I worked very hard to. I'm very conscious of the fact that I am seen and I've written about, and I kind of know myself in terms of it being a particular perspective. So when I work with other communities, I'm always a little uncomfortable, particularly now, and that I'm also aware that some of the communities aren't necessarily wanting me to write about them, and that's certainly worthy. And so if I choose to, it's because I really feel there's value, and that I acknowledge the fact that I bring with me all of my history. I don't deny it. And so please look at the material knowing that the writer acknowledges his own history. So as he talks about these issues, perhaps they are biased, perhaps they are all these things, but I want you to know that the writer is aware of that and still feels and makes the choice that given the times, given where we are, the writer still feels it's worth doing, just because it might give us a little more information.
Please join me in thanking Karen and Philip